My child, what you are about to hear was never supposed to reach your ears. Yet the moment has finally arrived. Someone believed they could erase your place in another person's heart forever. But they underestimated what truth sounds like when it refuses to stay silent. Today, a single hidden recording is about to destroy months of carefully planned lies. And once it begins to play, nobody in that room will ever see your person the same way again. Before this story reaches its ending, you will understand why some connections cannot be replaced, no matter how many new faces appear. Listen carefully. Your person never expected that day to unfold the way it did. They had been told it was only a simple family gathering, nothing more than an opportunity to meet someone whose family had been recommended by trusted relatives. Every detail had already been arranged before they even arrived. Smiles filled the room, polite conversations floated through the air, and everyone behaved as though the future had already been decided. Parents exchanged hopeful glances. Relatives whispered about compatibility, timing, and how perfect everything seemed. The atmosphere carried the confidence of people who believed every answer had already been written before a single question had been asked. Only one person in that room looked different. Your person smiled when expected, answered every question politely, and thanked everyone for their kindness, yet inside their heart there was a silence that refused to disappear. No matter how hard they tried to convince themselves to move forward, something invisible kept pulling them backward toward memories that had never truly left. They could not explain it. They could not defend it. They simply felt that an unfinished chapter was still waiting somewhere beyond the walls of that house. The family introducing the new marriage match noticed none of it. They spoke proudly about the future. They described dreams, plans, celebrations, and dates that could soon become reality. Every sentence pushed the conversation closer to commitment. Every smile assumed agreement. But destiny has a strange habit of arriving quietly. At the far end of the room sat one elderly relative who had barely spoken since everyone arrived. Unlike the others, this person watched every expression on your person's face instead of listening to the conversations. They noticed every forced smile, every distant look, every moment when your person's eyes wandered toward the window as though searching for someone who was not there. Don't skip. Without warning, the elderly relative stood up and walked toward an old wooden cabinet placed against the wall. Nobody paid much attention at first. Everyone assumed they were simply looking for teacups or family photographs. Instead, they reached into a drawer and removed a small digital recorder that looked worn by time. The room became quiet. One family member immediately asked why such an old device had been brought out during an important meeting. The elderly relative did not answer. Instead, they looked directly at your person and asked only one question. Before anyone makes a decision today, is there someone whose voice you have never truly forgotten? The question landed like thunder. Your person froze. Several relatives laughed nervously, assuming it was nothing more than sentimental conversation. Others encouraged everyone to ignore the interruption and continue discussing the marriage proposal. But the elderly relatives slowly shook their head. No, they whispered. Some decisions should never be made before hearing the truth. They placed the recorder carefully on the center table. Nobody in the room knew what was inside it. Nobody except one person, whose expression suddenly changed completely. Across the room, a distant relative who had been unusually confident since the meeting began lost all color in their face. Their hands tightened around the cup they were holding. A single drop of tea spilled onto the floor, yet they barely noticed. Their breathing became uneven. It was as though they already knew exactly what that recording contained. Your person noticed the fear immediately. For the first time that afternoon, they stopped pretending to smile. Every conversation disappeared. Every eye turned toward the recorder. The elderly relative pressed one button. A burst of static filled the room. For several long seconds, nothing else happened. People exchanged confused looks. Someone suggested turning it off because perhaps the batteries were dead. Then, a familiar voice emerged through the speaker. Soft, emotional, unmistakably real. Your person's heartbeat stopped for a moment. Because the very first words spoken on that recording were, "I don't know if you'll ever hear this, but there is only one person my heart has never been able to leave." And before anyone could react, your name was spoken. The entire room fell into absolute silence. Your person could not breathe for several seconds after hearing your name spoken so clearly. The room that had been filled with polite conversation only moments before now felt impossibly still. Every face turned toward your person, waiting for some explanation, while the recorder continued to play without caring that every word was changing the course of the meeting. No one reached to stop it. No one dared interrupt. The voice on the recording sounded calm, but underneath every sentence was an honesty that could never have been rehearsed. It spoke about a connection that, don't skip. The recording continued by revealing something nobody expected. The voice explained that someone close to the family had worked very hard to make sure your person would never receive certain messages, letters, and phone calls. Every attempt to reconnect had mysteriously failed, not because the feelings had disappeared, but because someone believed the truth would ruin their carefully prepared plans. At first the relatives looked at one another with disbelief, but then small memories began returning. One remembered a phone call that had never been delivered. Another remembered a letter that had suddenly gone missing. Someone else quietly admitted that important conversations had often been interrupted by the very same family member sitting silently across the room. Piece by piece, events that had once seemed meaningless now formed a pattern too obvious to ignore. Your person remained motionless, trying to understand how many opportunities had been stolen without their knowledge. Even the family introducing the new marriage match could sense that they had unknowingly walked into a story that had started long before they arrived. Then the recording became even more personal. The voice described specific moments that only two hearts connected by genuine memories could possibly recognize: an unexpected meeting, a promise never spoken aloud, a goodbye that never truly felt like the end, and a quiet hope that one day the truth would finally find its way back. There was no anger in those words, only sadness mixed with unwavering certainty. It ended with a sentence that caused every person in the room to lower their eyes. If they are ever asked to choose a future without knowing the whole truth, please let them hear my voice first. I can accept rejection, but I cannot accept a decision built on lies. As the final sentence echoed through the room, the recorder clicked into silence. No music followed. No dramatic ending. Only complete stillness. The relatives who had entered the meeting confident that an engagement was only a matter of time now found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew. And while everyone remained frozen, the one family member who had turned pale since the recording began quietly stood from their chair and took a slow step toward the door, hoping no one would notice. But someone already had. The faint sound of the chair scraping across the floor was enough to draw every eye toward the family member attempting to leave. Until that moment, they had remained unusually quiet, avoiding every conversation and refusing to look directly at your person. Now, with the recording finished, their urgency to disappear spoke louder than any explanation they could have offered. The elderly relative immediately asked them to stop. It was not a loud command, yet it carried enough authority to freeze the entire room. Nobody moved. Even the family who had come to discuss the new marriage match instinctively stepped back, sensing that they were witnessing the unraveling of a truth that had been hidden for years. Your person watched in complete disbelief as nervous hands trembled, eyes searched desperately for an escape, and confidence vanished from someone who had always seemed certain they controlled the situation. In that silence, everyone understood the same thing without saying a single word. People do not run from lies they never told, they run from truths they fear are finally catching them. Don't skip. The elderly relative slowly reached into the same drawer and removed a small envelope that had clearly been protected for a very long time. The paper had faded with age, but the seal had never been broken. Holding it carefully, they explained that the recording had never been meant to stand alone. It had been left together with written instructions, along with a request that if your person was ever pressured into accepting another marriage before hearing the full truth, both the recording and the envelope must be revealed together. A wave of confusion swept through the room. Several relatives insisted they had never seen the envelope before. Others whispered that someone must have hidden it intentionally. Your person's heartbeat quickened as the envelope was placed on the table beside the recorder. Every second seemed heavier than the last. The room no longer felt like a place where families were discussing a marriage proposal. It had become a courtroom where years of silence were about to be judged. The elderly relative finally opened the envelope and unfolded a handwritten letter. The first lines described dates, conversations, and promises that matched the recording perfectly. It revealed that repeated attempts had been made to reach your person, but each one had mysteriously failed before arriving. It mentioned phone numbers that suddenly changed, messages that disappeared without explanation, and invitations that were never delivered. As the letter continued, one sentence caused an audible gasp from the room. It stated that a trusted family member had personally insisted that every attempt at communication be stopped because they believed your person should never return. Instantly, every face turned toward the same individual who had tried to leave moments earlier. Their lips parted as if to defend themselves, yet no words came out. The silence around them became impossible to bear. Your person felt a mixture of shock, heartbreak, and determination unlike anything they had ever experienced. For the first time, pieces of a story that had never made sense were falling perfectly into place. And just when everyone believed the biggest revelation had already been uncovered, the elderly relative quietly said, "There is one final item that none of you have seen yet. And once it is placed on this table, someone in this room will no longer be able to deny what they have done." The front door opened so slowly that its creak seemed louder than every shocking word that had just echoed through the room. Every person instinctively turned toward the entrance. The owner of the hidden voice had arrived, not with anger or confidence, but with a face carrying the unmistakable weight of regret. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Even the family that had come to introduce the new marriage match remained completely still, sensing that they were witnessing the final collapse of a carefully protected secret. The newcomer looked first at your person, then at the elderly relative, and finally at the frightened family member standing near the doorway. Their expression revealed everything before a single sentence was spoken. It was the face of someone who had spent years pretending silence was easier than honesty, only to discover that the truth always arrives when it is least expected. Your person's heart pounded as memories, unanswered questions, and years of confusion seemed to gather into one overwhelming moment. They did not know whether to hope for answers or prepare for even greater heartbreak. "Don't skip." The newcomer slowly walked to the center of the room and asked for permission to speak. Nobody objected. Every eye remained fixed on them as they admitted that the recording everyone had just heard was real. They confessed that years earlier they had witnessed conversations that should never have happened. They had heard plans being made to separate two people simply because certain relatives believed another marriage would bring greater status, influence, and approval. At first they had remained silent, convincing themselves it was none of their business. But silence soon became guilt. They watched letters disappear, phone calls go unanswered, invitations mysteriously vanish, and every attempt at reconciliation fail before either side even knew it had happened. They explained that the secret recording had been created on the day they realized the deception had gone too far. They feared the original evidence might someday be destroyed, so they secretly made copies and entrusted them to the elderly relative with one request: if another marriage was ever arranged before the full truth came out, every piece of evidence must finally be revealed. As these words settled over the room, several relatives lowered their heads in shame, realizing they had unknowingly believed a carefully manufactured story for years. The frightened family member finally tried to defend themselves, insisting they had only wanted what they believed was best for everyone. But before they could continue, the newcomer quietly placed one final document on the table. It was a timeline listing every intercepted message, every canceled meeting, every hidden letter, and every false explanation that had been given to both families. Each event matched dates already mentioned in the handwritten letter and the recordings. There were even signatures and written notes proving that the separation had never happened naturally, it had been deliberately engineered. A wave of disbelief swept across the room. The family who had come to discuss the new marriage match respectfully stood and announced that they could not continue any marriage conversation while such a painful truth remained unresolved. They offered their sincere respect to your person before quietly leaving, understanding that another story had never truly ended. As the front door closed behind them, the room became silent once again. Your person slowly looked toward the elderly relative, expecting there could be no greater revelation than this. But the elderly relative gently shook their head and whispered, "There is still one." The room remained silent after the last family left. No one reached for the recorder or the letters. The evidence lying across the table had already changed the course of the day more than anyone believed possible. Your person stood motionless, looking from the elderly relative to the unopened envelope marked, "Open only when the truth has finally been revealed." With careful hands, the elderly relative broke the seal and unfolded a single sheet of paper. The handwriting matched the earlier letters. It began with a simple sentence. "If you are reading this, then the truth has finally found its way home." Everyone listened as the letter explained that love had never been the problem. Fear, pride, and the desire to control the future had driven people to make decisions on behalf of others. The writer described years of hoping that one honest conversation could replace countless misunderstandings, but every attempt had been interrupted before it could happen. Rather than asking for revenge or blame, the letter asked only for one thing: that every future decision be made with complete honesty, free from hidden agendas and unanswered questions. As the final paragraph was read aloud, several relatives quietly admitted they had accepted rumors without ever asking whether they were true. Others apologized for remaining silent when they sensed something was wrong. The family member who had hidden the letters lowered their head and acknowledged that their choices had caused pain far beyond what they had imagined. No excuse could erase the consequences, but the admission itself marked the first genuine step toward accountability. Your person looked at the stack of unopened letters resting on the table. Years of unanswered questions were contained inside them, waiting to be read one by one. Instead of opening them immediately, they carefully gathered them together and said that some words deserved to be read in private, with the respect they should always have received. The elderly relative smiled gently. The purpose of today was never to force a decision, they said. It was to make sure no decision was made while the truth remained hidden. For the first time that day, the atmosphere in the room began to soften. The future was still uncertain. Important conversations still needed to happen. Trust would have to be rebuilt slowly, and forgiveness could not be demanded overnight. But everyone now understood that any path forward would be based on honesty rather than deception. Your person picked up the recorder one last time before placing it back inside the wooden box. "This recording changed everything," they said quietly. "Not because it told us what to choose, but because it finally allowed us to choose with the truth." As evening light filled the room through the open window, those present realized they had witnessed not the end of a story, but the beginning of one built on openness instead of silence.